and they take flight. Today we stand at the threshold of what we hope will be America's next golden age. We tackle the timely topic of ESG and stakeholder capitalism. This is a moment that calls for clarity, for courage, and the guts to call out the absurd when we see it. And who better to guide us through that than Andy Puzder? Not just any leader, Andy Puzder has lived and breathed free market capitalism. As the former CEO of CKE Restaurants, he turned the company into a job-creating behemoth, dishing out opportunity with the same efficiency as its burgers and fries. But what truly distinguishes Andy and his ability to slice through the jargon, reminding us about the fundamentals, free markets, individual liberty, and the belief that prosperity grows from Main Street, not from mandates. He's been vocal in critiquing ESG-driven stakeholder capitalism, perhaps describing it as a recipe for economic ruin, seasoned heavily with ideology. Andy has warned us that this approach threatens the very freedoms that fuel America's opportunity engine, standing firm in his advocacy for values that foster genuine, enduring opportunity for all. As we prepare to usher in a new era, there's no better navigator for these waters than the man who understands that the battle for freedom is fought not just in boardrooms, but with bold ideas, unwavering leadership, and when necessary, some hard truths. We are proud to call him a distinguished fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Please join me in welcoming one of America's most insightful and fearless proponents of free markets and free people, Andy Puzder.
Thank you, Andy. I appreciate that very much, that over-generous introduction. Good to see everybody. Thank you for braving the cold weather and making it here this morning. I just walked from next door and I had to wear my gloves and hat. It's a very cold morning out there. There are books back there. This is the book that I just had come out yesterday. It's called The Tyranny for the Good of Its Victims, The Ugly Truth About Stakeholder Capitalism. The first part I borrowed from C.S. Lewis, who talked about how tyrants that are believe they're acting for our benefit are so much more dangerous than tyrants that are acting for their own benefit, because if they're acting for their own benefit, they might stop. When they're acting for our benefit, they never stop. The second part of the title is The Ugly Truth About Stakeholder Capitalism. So what is the ugly truth about stakeholder capitalism? Well, the ugly truth is it isn't capitalism at all. It's an effort to destroy free market capitalism. It's socialism in sheep's clothing. It's a collectivist ideology designed to empower a group of financial elites to impose their social and political goals on us in order to protect us, because they don't trust us to make decisions for ourselves, our nation, or our planet. It's a rejection of both democracy and free market capitalism, which empower we the people to make these kinds of decisions for ourselves. Now, this isn't an exaggeration. You've probably noticed that there are big companies out there, big American companies you've relied on and looked to your entire life, who are doing things that just seem incomprehensible to you. Why would Disney, when I was raising my kids, my older kids, if they were watching a movie, I'd say to my wife, is this an okay movie for them to watch? And she'd go, it's just a Disney movie. It's fine. And you thought, okay, it's a Disney movie, must be okay. Why would Disney, Target, and a company like Anheuser-Busch that's appealing to, guys that drink beer, why would they adopt or advance a transgender agenda? Why would ExxonMobil and Chevron adopt net zero carbon emission policies when the product that justifies their existence is gas and oil? Well, it's because there really is a small group of elites, financial elites, who run the largest asset management firms in the world, who are out there forcing their radical leftist woke cultural agenda on the American business community. Now, the primary firms involved in this are asset manager megagiants, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, who over the past 25, 35 years have accumulated an unprecedented level of share ownership in virtually every American publicly traded company. Voting the shares they hold on behalf of their clients allows them to force their environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, agenda on the American business community. Now, ESG sounds so good, right? Environmental, social, and justice. I mean, how bad could that be? It sounds so moralistic. Well, it's supposed to sound that way so you won't think about it. It's a lot like the language newspeak in the novel 1984 by George Orwell, where newspeak was a bunch of terms that sounded great, very fluffy terms, meant nothing, so the government could fill in the meaning. Well, it's the same with environmental, social, and justice. You're not supposed to think about what it means. Now, when these firms were thinking about, when they were contemplating using their clients' assets to advance their social and political agenda, they faced a problem. The problem is that asset managers have a traditional duty to maximize returns for their investors. Well, you can't maximize returns for your investors if you're at the same time trying to get the companies in which you invest their monies to advocate for or follow these ESG, these social and political goals, which will diminish their profits. You can't maximize returns and diminish profits at the same time. So they needed to expand their duties to a broader group of individuals, and to do that, they looked to something called stakeholder capitalism. Think of ESG as the agenda and stakeholder capitalism as the economic theory that allows them to pursue that agenda. Stakeholder capitalism was developed by Klaus Schwab of World Economic Forum fame back in the 1950s. And the idea is that a corporation is responsible not only for its shareholders, but for everybody that is in any way affected by the company. So consumers, customers, employees, suppliers, the community, in other words, everybody. And the idea is that that's supposed to be a proxy for society, so that your obligation now as a company under stakeholder capitalism isn't just to your investors, it's actually to society, which allows the investment managers who are advocating for this to have these companies pursue a social policy, social goals, right? So in the guise of trying to protect this broad group of amorphous so-called stakeholders. I say so-called stakeholders because the funny thing about them is they have no stake in the company, right? They're called stakeholders, but they have no investment. But this amorphous group of stakeholders, in the guise of protecting them, they advance their ESG agenda. Now, of course, this group has no say in whether or not it thinks the ESG agenda is in its best interest, right? But society does not, we don't get to vote on it. We don't get to pursue these goals through our free market purchases. So what these asset management firms have done is they've gone from being answerable to a group of investors who will hold them responsible for maximizing returns to a group of, this amorphous group of stakeholders who will hold them answerable for nothing. Because when society can't speak through elections or free market purchases, it has no way to express its will, which leads a vacuum, an opening for somebody to come in and say, we know what's best for society. We will make the decisions as to what's best for society. We know where the culture should go. We know where society should go, which is why I say this is nothing but socialism in sheep's clothing. ESG is their champagne socialism, social justice agenda. This is their agenda, this ESG agenda, the diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. By the way, the S in ESG is DEI, it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. But this agenda, this isn't normal socialism where you're talking about redistributing wealth, or you're talking about trying to help workers of the world arise. We're not talking about helping the working class. This is to implement an elitist agenda that will really destroy working and middle classes. 40% of the food that's produced in the world depends on carbon-based fertilizers. People in Ghana or Kenya, the poor people in South America or even in Detroit and Chicago, they're not going to benefit from a net zero carbon emission because they can't afford it. It's being implemented by people who can actually afford it. So I wrote Stakeholder Capitalism to disclose who these individuals are that have been pursuing this agenda. how they're pursuing it, what the justification is. I've got a whole chapter on the incredible benefits of free market capitalism, which, to quote Barack Obama, have created the greatest wealth in human history and lifted billions of people out of poverty. Why would you mess with that? I mean, that's a pretty good system. So I wrote the book to discuss all of that. I hope you'll read it. I hope when reading it, you'll enjoy it as much as I enjoyed writing it. And thank you all again for coming this morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I'm going to turn it back to Andrew. Thank you.
Come on up, David. Thank you very much, Andy. Now I'd like to have our colleague David Burton join us on stage. David's a senior research fellow here at the Heritage Foundation, focuses on capital markets, on administrative law, regulatory agencies, and things like that. And David just wrote a paper on ESG, DEI, what to do about it. And so I'm going to turn to David and say, David, what do we do about it? The floor is yours.
Simple question.
Yeah.
Complex answer.
Yeah.
The problem is that ESG and DEI have now polluted almost every space in government, in business, and in academia. So the solution about what to do about it is long. In my paper, I have 40 specific recommendations.
Let's not go through all 40.
39?
But they're all good.
They're all good. They're all good. Let's hit some of the top ones.
Well, they include things for Congress to do, things that the new Trump administration can do, things that state legislators can do, and things that state executive branches can do. But, I mean, on the DEI side of it, there's a piece of legislation called the Dismantle DEI Act that Senator Vance, soon to be Vice President Vance, sponsored in the Senate, and Representative Cloud sponsored in the House, that was reported out of the House Oversight Subcommittee. That legislation would basically excise DEI from the federal government. So federal employment practices, federal contracting, federal advisory committees, federal procurement, and educational accreditation and so on and so forth, that also would force the financial regulators to quit doing DEI and requiring the regulated entities such as banks or public companies or self-regulatory organizations do DEI. So that's a fairly comprehensive assault on DEI. In the securities area, there's a whole host of things. I mean, under Gary Gensler, the SEC has been very woke. They have the most aggressive climate change rule that's currently tied up in the courts. And there's things we need to do in terms of the securities laws. There's things we need to do in banking to ensure that the banks aren't allocating capital either for climate change reasons or targeting firearms manufacturers, or pick your woke agenda. At the state level, we've had some success on a website, www.esghurts. There's 5 pieces of model legislation that state legislators can look at. One of those we've had some success. I think 12 states now, maybe 13, have enacted it, which would require that state pension money be invested to achieve a return for the plan beneficiaries, and not allow them to invest for ESG purposes. In other words, throw their retirees under the bus to achieve left-wing political purposes. There's a need to do similar things in the federal DOL. The law called ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, says that all retirement plans have to be invested solely for the benefit of plan beneficiaries and exclusively for the purpose of providing benefits. The Biden DOL has basically green-lighted breaking ties if there are 2 competing investment alternatives, so that one can have be chosen for ESG purposes. We need to basically make that unlawful. The list goes on.
The list goes on. For those in the room, you may have heard loud sirens go by. That's because Andy mentioned Barack Obama's name at a Heritage Foundation event. We don't allow that here, so the police are coming in. But we'll go over to you, Andy, on that. You know, David mentioned the list of things that are possible. His paper is a great 59 pages, 170 endnotes, very well researched and documented, as is all of David's research. But you know, Andy, David mentioned something really important, which is the success at the state level, where we were able to be on offense for common sense here, the fiduciary rule and all that. But Heritage Foundation, Heritage Action, model legislation, ALEC, model legislation. You worked on a lot of this. You talked to a lot of governors and senators and state legislators. What's your thought about the momentum at the state level, Andy, and maybe what's next in that respect?
Yeah, the momentum at the state level has been really good. This is really, you've probably heard recently about a lot of organizations withdrawing from these climate activist groups, banks, and BlackRock BlackRock withdrew from the Net Zero Asset Managers Coalition initiative, which is a huge initiative. I mean, it was like $43 trillion in invested assets by the members of that group, and they all committed to encourage the companies in which they invested to pursue these net zero goals. BlackRock withdrew, and a week later, the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative decided to suspend its activity, which gives you some idea just how important BlackRock is, let alone the big three, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. So we've seen progress, and you certainly heard about the DEI, the companies that are running away from DEI like it's you know, sitting in the middle of Pacific Palisades and the winds are about to kick up and it's going to catch fire. I mean, everybody's getting away from it as quickly as they possibly can. And a lot of that has to do with things we've done at the state level, including some legislation that took the provisions of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act that David mentioned, which require that fiduciaries focus solely on their beneficiaries and exclusively on maximizing their returns, generating financial returns on their assets. But it only applies to private pension funds like the Teamsters or the AFL-CIO. It doesn't apply to government pension plans like those for the police and the fire and the teachers and state employees. So we got a model at Heritage. Heritage was in the resistance. I call this group of people that have been fighting ESG and stakeholder capitalism the resistance in my book. And Heritage has been really key in kind of organizing the resistance and helping these disparate groups move forward in a more organized way. We came up with a Heritage version of this bill and a version of a state fiduciary duty bill, kind of like ERISA, but to apply to these state plans. And the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, came up with a similar bill. Then we all worked together. The bills really weren't that materially different. And they passed in about 14 states. And so we've now seen lawsuits filed to enforce these fiduciary duties. We've seen states withdraw money from BlackRock in particular. Florida withdrew a huge amount, as did Texas. We've seen lawsuits filed for antitrust violations. 11 states filed an antitrust suit against BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard for colluding to drive energy prices up by these net zero policies. And there was a report, and by the way, a key to that was that the big three had to actually ignore their fiduciary duty to their investors to accomplish these goals. And then you've got a report that just came out of the House Judiciary Committee. It's 70 pages long. It's a devastating report on BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard colluding with big blue state pension funds, New York, California, Minnesota, and some European investment funds, and these huge proxy advisory firms that you've probably heard about. They manage about 97% of the proxy advisory business in the United States. They're called Glass Lewis and ISS. Yeah, and they're foreign owned, and they probably control somewhere between 10 and 25% of the proxy voting. When combined with, as David was mentioning yesterday in a discussion we had, if you take the three guys that run BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, and there's another large asset management firm we haven't talked about, but take those four and add in the two proxy advisory firms, you have 6 people that really can control the U.S. business sector, can control the U.S. economy, and that's something that shouldn't be the case. But we are moving forward. This House Judiciary Report is important because now the Trump people come in, right? And they're going to be, under Pam Bondi is going to be the antitrust division. And you're going to have a new Secretary of Labor who's going to come in and hopefully enforce the provisions of ERISA that the Biden administration has not been enforcing. So I think we're seeing at the state level Thanks to the mobilization we had, we didn't sit back and say we have to wait for the next election. And now at the federal level, with Trump's victory, we can start to make some headway on this. But keep in mind, they're just going to hide. They're just going to change the acronyms. They don't care if you call it ESG and DEI. What they care about is the substance. And they're walking away from the acronyms. They're fleeing. But let's see if they walk away from the substance. Watch for their proxy advisory guidelines for BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard that come out in the next couple of months. And then on top of that, look to how corporations are compensating their management teams. Are they compensating them to meet DEI goals? Are they compensating them to meet these net zero goals? Because if they are, then they haven't walked away from anything.
It's a great point about the acronyms. If you think about corporate social responsibility and socially responsible investing and environmental, social and governance and diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's CSR, SRI, ESG, DEI. It's the alphabet soup of Marxism. And David, in your paper, you have a line right there, right up front and center, that these are immoral. And I think the moral high ground is a really interesting thing here, because to Andy's point, and in his book he gets into it, these are collectivists that are trying to push an agenda, and they will not stop. They'll change the words and they'll do these things. You have a very, very direct point. These are immoral practices. Expand on that a little bit.
Well, the DEI stuff is a rejection of the principle that we're all created equal and that we're entitled to equal protection of the law. It's overtly racist. And I thought we'd gotten past the federal government and state and local governments pushing racist policies. I was wrong. At some level, I think Joe Biden's right. We do live in a systemically racist country, but the racists are in the White House for another week or 5 days, and then we'll be able to move beyond it. On the ESG side, or particularly, it's a little bit more subtle, but in Anglo-American law for centuries, we've had the concept of a fiduciary, someone that's stewarding someone else's money, and they have a duty towards the person for whom they've assumed responsibility. And these fiduciaries, whether they're registered investment advisors or pension plan managers or whomever, are systematically blowing through those fiduciary duties now to achieve the left-wing political objectives of the investment advisors without the consent of investors. And that, or most of whom are, saving for their retirement. And that also is unethical and needs to stop. As one of the recommendations I make in the paper is that we basically amend the Securities Act, the Securities Exchange Act, the Investment Advisors Act, and the Investment Company Act, so that ignoring your fiduciary duty becomes a violation of those, and those guys can get sanctioned and kicked out of the industry for violating their fiduciary duty. But that also leads to another point, and both at the state and federal level, we need to have people in the executive branch, whether it's the Securities and Exchange Commission or the DOJ at the federal level, or alternatively AGs and state treasurers at the state level, that pursue people who are violating their duties to others, people who have a fiduciary duty and then just blow through it to achieve political objectives.
It's an excellent point. Back to you, Andy Puzder. If you think about the sort of offensive effort by collectivists on this front, one of the anecdotes that you have in the book, and you spoke to it recently as well, but 4,800 directors, corporate directors, were targeted by the asset managers and the proxy services, and that changed their behavior. And we've heard Larry Fink himself on TV say that we need to force behaviors. But talk a little bit about that and how they weaponize this capital.
So you might have heard back in 2019 a group called the Business Roundtable, which was at that point Jamie Dimon was heading it. After decades of pursuing shareholder capitalism, acknowledging that their duties were to their investors, as Milton Friedman had written in the New York Times back in the early 1960s. In 2019, the Business Roundtable said, we're no longer Milton Friedman shareholder capitalists, we're now going to be stakeholder capitalists. And everybody, having been a CEO, I retired 2 years before that, but I said, what the hell just happened? I mean, why would they do this? Well, what you found out when BlackRock, Larry Fink, BlackRock CEO, used to issue these letters every year to America's CEOs. He stopped a couple years ago, I think because they kept getting him in trouble. But in 2020, he came out with a letter where he actually bragged about the fact that in the prior year, BlackRock had voted against voted against or withheld their votes for 4,800 directors at 2,700 U.S. publicly traded companies. I mean, that is a comprehensive government level type action. I mean, I was astounded when I read that. And all of a sudden what happened with the Business Roundtable the year before kind of made sense to me, because none of us knew that BlackRock, and who knows what State Street and Vanguard were doing at the same time. You know, none of us knew how they were voting, but I guarantee you the CEOs of the companies that were getting their directors who were friendly to them voted off boards, knew what was going on and realized they had to make a big change. So this is the kind of power that you get when you manage. I think the big three together manage about $21 trillion. I think it's up to 23 trillion now. But that's tremendous power. 21, 23 million, that's 80% of the GDP of the United States every year. It's more than the GDP of every country in the world, except for the United States and China. It's $65,000 per person in the United States. This is a tremendous amount of money, and it gives them tremendous power over our business community and the ability to implement this leftist woke agenda.
And it's about a third of the market capitalization. So
yes,
when you add the big 3 or 4 asset managers and the 2 proxy advisory firms, they nearly control or literally control virtually every public company in America. That means it means less people than are sitting at this table over here control half of the American economy. And that's problematic, period. But it's particularly problematic now that they become increasingly woke and embracing progressive politics. And it needs to change, and we need to enact reforms that will make sure that doesn't happen.
I'll start with you, Andy Puzder. What would you say to, a retiree, a teacher who spent 35 years teaching and is a retiree and is watching this effort on behalf of ideological goals depress their retirement savings? How do they animate themselves to think about it a little bit differently? What should they call for?
Well, I think they should write to the trustees of the pension funds that are managing their assets. Yeah, there was a decision in Texas a couple weeks ago or last week for American Airlines, where American Airlines had been sued because they used BlackRock as a financial advisor, even though they were acting to accomplish these climate goals as opposed to acting to advance the returns for their investors. And the judge, there was a summary judgment motion, and the judge denied it. The judge said there is evidence that they're doing this. I think they should write to the trustees of their pension funds and point to this suit and say, are you paying attention to this? Are you protecting our assets? Who do you use to manage our assets? And I think that's the kind of thing that's going to get BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard to change the way they conduct business. And it also might get the pension funds in which they're invested to be a little more careful about how they protect the assets they're managing.
Yeah, that was a federal district court judge that took ERISA seriously.
Yes.
And that's a very positive development.
And then to you, David, maybe a similar question. What would you say to, a police officer retiring in Illinois whose pension is held up, is underfunded, but the state of Illinois uses ESG criteria to invest those pension funds? How would they animate themselves in the state of Illinois to push back on that?
Well, one thing would be to pass the model legislation that we drafted to require that it be invested to achieve a return for the plan.
But if you're sitting across the table from a retired police officer, what should that retired police officer do in the state of Illinois? Who should he talk to? He can move.
No, I mean, seriously, he would have to lobby his state legislators to pass bills requiring that the funds be invested to achieve a return and the highest benefits possible for the beneficiaries of the plan, and not to achieve left-wing political ends.
Hey, David, don't you think most states already have a law that says that? They also could just check out their traditional state law.
Well, I mean, this is a problem throughout the law now. I mean, until a few years ago, everybody knew what ERISA meant, that it had to be invested solely and exclusively for the benefit of the plan participants. But the left constantly tries to warp language. That's why I focus on ties. I mean, the DOL permitted breaking ties. And if you want to purposefully create ties, it's easy. I mean, for example, you divide all the potential investments into categories 1 through 5, 1 being the best. There's about 5,000 possibilities, 5,000 operating companies. So you have 1,000 ties, which means you can break them using left-wing ESG criteria. They're doing the same thing on materiality, and the Europeans already have with their so-called double materiality. Throughout the law, the left is basically trying to warp the meaning of these terms to achieve progressive ends, and we need to slap that down. There are still some judges that are more honest about how they interpret statutes. The demise of Chevron deference probably will mean that more judges are willing to look at the meaning of the statute themselves rather than just defer to the government's position. But there's a tremendous amount of work that we need to do.
Yeah, I would say to our fellow Americans, if your retirement funds, your 401k, any of your investments are invested in ESG and non-pecuniary things, so not adhering to the highest return, you ought to raise holy hell. You ought to raise holy hell with your asset managers and the people that you talk to, and you ought to do it in your state legislatures because it's immoral and they're taking away your property in the process. I'm going to ask Andy Puzzler a question, and then I'd love to open it up for questions in the room here. But Andy, think about a company like Boeing and the commitments that they make and their compensation to CEOs. You talked about it up here. You certainly go into more detail in the book, but Boeing has a new CEO. Kelly Ortberg is his name. He's wrestling with a big change that has to happen there. They had product failure. They lost lives. They're trying to recoup that. Make better investments and whatnot. But what would your counsel be to him in the boardroom, and what should they be thinking about?
Well, they've had problems at Boeing since 2018, 2019, with planes kind of falling out of the sky, panels flying off, things going wrong with the plane, so that people no longer trust the safety of Boeing's aircraft. And up until a couple of years ago, they had a bonus plan that was based, I think, 85% on profits and 15% on safety and DEI. So you could get the 15% by safety and you didn't have to focus on safety. You could get it if you just met these DEI goals. So basically, what they were telling management was that if you can get a panel on a plane with 3 bolts instead of 4, you'll make a little more money. So let's focus on profit. And then as far as safety, yeah, that's in the bonus too. But if you meet your DEI criteria, that's kind of equal to safety. And you could see the results for Boeing. Now, Boeing has now shifted its bonus plan to where it's a very heavy emphasis on safety. Why they didn't send the message to not only the American populace, but the populace of the world, that their number one focus was safety. I mean, it would seem like, when all this stuff started to happen, they should have had a bonus plan that said, no, we're bonusing our people, 99% on safety and 1% on everything else. I mean, safety is job one. Our planes are going to be safe and reliable, and we're going to get them up there, and they're going to stay up, and you should feel safe traveling on them. They kind of let that go away, sort of like Disney let the family values thing go away, where you could trust a Disney movie. Boeing kind of left the impression that their products were solid and safe go away, and they need to rebuild that. So I would focus very verbally and very often on the fact that everything we're doing is now product, quality, safety focused. And if they do that, I think Boeing can come back. If they don't do it, and every time there's even a little problem, there's going to be big headlines. So they need to make a shift.
I like that. The best long-term value creation for a company that flies airplanes is to have those airplanes come down safely, and have safety and probably some sort of engine power thing would be another one that they should do. Questions in the room? We would love to hear. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I have a quick one. Why doesn't Dodge v. Ford fix all this? And then my other one that's
Here you go. We'll go ahead and grab the microphone and repeat your question, yeah.
It's a little more offensive.
What was your
is-
first, say your first?
My first one is why doesn't all this? Why doesn't Dodge v. Ford fix all this? The 19 Supreme Court rule. But the other thing is, more importantly, why aren't we going more offensive since we have the moment right now on, to me, going after Desperate Impact, Griggs v. Duke, and kind of the DEI stuff, since we right now we've captured the moment of these corporations moving our way. I don't think it's enough to go this kind of. Every proposal you have is probably great, but we should probably be going further since we have them kind of captured. We should push even further for more conservative reforms.
So Dodge versus Ford was a case where the Dodge brothers had invested in Ford. There was no Dodge at the time. They'd invested in Ford, and Ford decided he was going to raise pay for employees. He was going to do things that didn't directly relate to giving returns to the Dodge brothers. And they went to court and sued, and they lost. And Ford was allowed to do the kinds of things it needed to do that Henry Ford, who was the CEO, thought would make the company more profitable. He didn't think that pinching every penny was going to result in a company that had long-term more value than if they did some of these things. And nobody objects. I mean, my objection, I don't care if a company thinks that a DEI policy will make it more profitable, like Ben & Jerry's, they should, or Starbucks, they should implement those. If that's what they think makes them more profitable, then do what you need to do. Or if you're a solar panel manufacturing company and you think net zero is a good thing because you manufacture solar panels, well, God bless you, that's what you should be doing. But the problem is when there are shareholders who are trying to do what the Dodge brothers were in effect doing, which is they're able to vote their shares and vote them against people who might otherwise be trying to encourage the profitability of the company. The object should always be to generate returns for your investors. The best way to do that is to let the CEOs of the various companies in this country do the best they can to try and maximize their returns. We're not dictating to them how they should maximize their returns. I don't want you to think that, I don't think any of us up here are advocating for a conservative ESG as opposed to the liberal ESG. What we want here is a neutral playing field where companies focus on doing the best they can for their investors, and if they're investing funds on behalf of others, for the people who they're investing funds for, and not for some other different purpose.
Let me add a couple things. First off, Dodge versus Ford was not a Supreme Court case. It was a Michigan state case interpreting Michigan state corporate statutes. So the legislatures over the years have changed their corporate statutes, but more importantly, they vary. The other thing is that case was largely about the fiduciary duty of a sort that corporate directors and managers owe to the shareholders. But there's also this thing called the business judgment rule, which in most states has evolved into a corporate director supremacy rule, meaning absent absolute theft from the corporation, the courts will let the directors do almost anything they want under the rubric of exercising business judgment. But that is a question of state corporate law, not federal law. And thankfully, in my opinion, corporate law is still governed by the states. So Texas's corporate law is not the same as Delaware, is not the same as Vermont's. It varies. And but the business judgment rule has largely subsumed the fiduciary duty that directors and officers owe to shareholders. And we now largely live in a world in which we don't have shareholder supremacy. We have director supremacy, and that probably needs to change.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for the question. Yes, ma'am. The microphone's coming over here for people that are listening online, watching online.
Our soon-to-be brain-addled soon-to-be ex-president, declared that we're in danger of being controlled by an oligarchy, which obviously you guys have identified already exists in part of the country. He just identified the wrong group because they favor him. But I wanted to ask actually a couple of questions. I thought some of the stuff you suggested was absolutely brilliant, especially Andy, the stuff you talked about, writing to the retired teachers and all that. That's something actually the RNC and other groups should be doing. It's a great fundraising ploy as well as getting information out to people. But this is a question I've tried to ask again and again to liberal friends. I'm going to ask you guys. Can you name any policy
We're your new liberal friends?
No, I'm
Okay,
trying
I'm
to
just
get
checking.
somebody intelligent now to maybe be able to address the questions. Can you name any policy that DEI has ever advanced that was successful, or any liberal, in the last 50 years, liberal policy that actually was successful? And secondly, can you name any climate scare tactic charge that ever proved to be true?
Well, the latter, I can't think of any. And by the way, Biden is so scared of oligarchs that he awarded the Medal of Freedom to George Soros.
Right, exactly,
This is-
exactly.
So he's such a genius.
Insane.
I don't know, David, you got an answer to the other part of that question?
I
Are
mean,
there
it sort
any?
of depends on your time frame, I suppose.
50 years.
Well, I would be willing to say that some of the early environmental efforts by liberals were successful because in an economic sense, they were policing externalities. You and I are old enough to remember when rivers burned, right?
That's true.
And the air in certain cities was extraordinarily unhealthful. Some of those initiatives, I think, made a difference.
So
In a
the
positive way.
EPA set up under Nixon that Ruckelshaus did those sort of things early on. Yeah.
So some of those early environmental initiatives, I think, had a positive effect, and both in economics terms and health terms. The climate change debate, I'll back up just one second. I wasn't terribly involved in that until it started polluting finance, and it has, and federal procurement and securities regulation and everything. Now I'm reasonably well schooled on it. And the one thing I've learned is that 99.9% of the people writing op-eds or on TV talking about it know nothing about it, right? It's really sort of awe-inspiring. They just repeat bromides. And once you take a dive into the climate science, it's vastly less certain than they opine. And then the next step is, okay, if we're going to remediate, say, greenhouse gas emissions, how much does that cost relative to the gains? There's never any of that at all, whatsoever. I mean, almost the entire climate change debate is fact-free. It's bordering on awe-inspiring. And that's one of the reasons why you get such ridiculousness. For example, the Securities and Exchange Commission climate change rule, the initial proposed rule, would have quadrupled the cost of being a public company in the United States, right? So the cost of every rule the SEC has done since 1934 and multiply by 4. And for what? Just so you get a bunch of lawyer-scrubbed verbiage in financial statements? I mean, it would have done nothing for the climate, but it would have enriched the lawyers, the accountants, the climate consultants, and the bureaucracies. That's the real goal, I think.
And see, that's the great stuff. When you bring that up, the liberals go nuts because they hate people getting money from anything. And also, catalytic converters create more CO2.
Yeah, all of these things are a scientific question. For example, catalytic converters. I know what they do, but I have no idea how well they do it and what a genuine cost-benefit analysis on it would be, and nor probably does anyone in this room, right? The point is, these are factual questions, scientific questions, combined with economic questions. I mean, the science is, does it do what they say? But then you have to say, okay, how much does it cost? And what benefit is that going to have? And that's almost never done. And then the last, I mean, cost-benefit analysis is nominally required in the federal regulatory process under Executive Order 12866 and OMB Circular A4. But if you ever actually go read them, they're a joke. They're not seriously done.
Yeah, excellent. Another question, yes, sir. And while the microphone's coming over, it would be interesting to think about. There's probably a company out there, say a solar panel company, that can point to some profitable bottom line, but it's an ideologically driven economy for them. They've got subsidized, you know, it's your tax dollars through the U.S. government, it's your tax dollars through World Bank or IMF and other things, or it's your capital that's owned by these other asset managers that's then allocated in this direction because they want to have a transition economy. It's all an ideologically driven economy, so it's higher cost for all of us. and lower returns for anybody that has those investments, certainly. Question?
I was just at a conference with hundreds of recruiters from all over the country, and they were talking about how all their companies are deprioritizing DEI, and they were lamenting it for the same reason that you said we're happy we're getting rid of it, because they were worried about racism. My question is, do you think that there's any chance for discourse with people with such fundamentally different beliefs, or do you just got to plow right through them with what we have coming up?
Well, racism is discriminating for or against people on the basis of their race, their skin color, their ethnicity, right? And that's what DEI requires. It requires racism. But again, Andy mentioned Newspeak. I mean, and just a sort of friendly amendment, I think it's like, it's more about not terms not having meaning, but almost flipping the meaning of the terms. And this is an example of that. Actually racist behavior is considered anti-racist, right? And they do it in dozens of areas. But this is one of the most pronounced, where behavior that is should be illegal under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is applauded and aggressively promoted. And that's another area where red state AGs could have a field day, is going after these folks for violating the anti-racism provisions of the Civil Rights Act. There is sort of a footnote here. NASDAQ had what they call a board diversity rule, requiring that all NASDAQ listed companies have at least 2 members of the correct race, the correct sex, did the correct thing in the bedroom, or they would have to explain in a public document why they didn't hire 2 directors of that sort of thing. And the NASDAQ has regulatory authority over its members. It's delegated that regulatory authority by the SEC under the Securities Exchange Act. And the courts finally, the Fifth Circuit specifically, ruled against that and found that it was unlawful. And to my knowledge, NASDAQ's not going to appeal that to the Supreme Court because they would probably lose. So we have made some wins in the courts, but that was a very long, drawn-out process at the SEC, and the SEC has to approve every NASDAQ rule, right? So the SEC, which is a government agency, and that's how the NASDAQ was trying to weasel out of it, approved it. So the SEC is a state actor and subject to these non-discrimination rules. The last thing is on that, most states do not treat corporate directors as employees. So they weren't subject to the Civil Rights Act because the non-discrimination provisions regarding employment only relate to employees.
When I was a young lawyer, I handled some race and sex discrimination cases. And the problem was that the lawyers wrote the manuals for the companies, and they all said, we don't discriminate on the basis of race or sex. We don't discriminate, on any basis. But so to prove that there was racial or sexual discrimination, you had to go to the data. You had to get all the hiring data, and then you proved it mathematically. That's the only. But today, every major company in the United States has a statement out there that we hire based on the basis of race and sex. You would think this would be a field day for attorneys to go out there and make these suits. With respect to the meeting you went to, we probably ought to get people to go to those meetings who really don't care what the people in the room think about them and whether or not they're concerned about getting a job or not get a job, to point out the things that you point to, stand up and say, hey, isn't what you're saying itself discriminatory? Isn't actually you're talking about racial preferences? Isn't that racism? And at least get people in the room to think about it. I think people are, particularly people, and I want to say your generation, but around your age, are very nervous about getting canceled or how society's going to treat them. They need to understand that's now changing, and that pretty soon I think we're going to see the opposite arise, because people are realizing what this DEI is all about and just how bad it is. I guarantee you people in Los Angeles know it today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's an article in Axios this morning, and it's both somewhat accurate, but it's also problematic in that it talks about across corporate America, there's like this comeuppance that's happening, and people feel free to speak. But they lean into the language where CEOs are going to be vulgar now, and people can say things that they couldn't say before. And it just goes to the fact that the left thinks they have this moral high ground on what's acceptable behavior, what's acceptable language. You know, you can't go to a conference on the left today and have a free speech conversation. The ideological straitjacket is real. It has infected corporate America. And if you think about the NASDAQ rule, and you think about the idea that a CEO, he or she, and maybe Andy, you can comment on this, you just did, but even to another extent, the CEO would sit there and say, I'm going to take this regulatory action by NASDAQ enforced by the SEC, that I have to choose board members a certain way and that they have to fit these categories and all this. They would say that this is ridiculous, I'm going to fight against it, except that their largest share owners are also pushing it, right? So it's really pernicious if you think about it. I mean, you would think CEOs, those men and women, would stand up and not lean into vulgarity, but they would lean into truth, and they would lean into just finding their voice again.
I never had to deal. We were a New York Stock Exchange company from when I took over in 2000. I ran the company that owned Carl's Jr. and Hardee's, and when I retired, we had about 4,000 restaurants in 45 states and 40 foreign countries, and did about $4 billion in revenue. But we were publicly traded in New York Stock Exchange from 2000 to 2010, and then we were owned by private equity firms. So I really never had to deal with this pernicious pressure from these BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. But I'll tell you what, when your major shareholders give you a call and they want to talk to you, you talk to them because they do have an influence on who can be directors for your company. You want their support, so they're electing directors that are good for the company and who support your agenda for the company. And so you listen, you ignore them at your risk. And if you take BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, to follow up on a point David made, they are the #1 shareholder, the largest shareholder, if you add 3 of them together, and there's some good reason to. They're the largest shareholders, about 80% of the companies in the S&P 500. That's 500 of America's leading companies. So they've got tremendous power, and they really can't be ignored anymore.
Excellent, thank you. Other questions? Sir, the microphone's coming over.
I like what David just pointed out, that when the rivers and lakes were on fire, the environmental requirements made some sense. And so the DEI was also concocted to allegedly address the racial discrimination. However, it has led to a vote bank politics of the Democratic Party and so on, and has led to corporate and company performance, safety degradation. I mean, if you look at an example like DC's metro system, that'll tell you what DEI can do, what damage the DEI can do. So given that its time is long past, and that's why people are running away from it. So it's timely that you guys want to address and make sure that we don't make that mistake continuously as we have been doing.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Thank you for that comment. I mean, the idea that excellence isn't colorblind is probably the most racist thinking that somebody could have, and it seems like that's what the other side is pushing. The idea that excellence is not colorblind. Other questions? No? Well, thank you all for joining us very much. Copies of Andy's book are in the back with complimentary copies, so please take one. Copies of David's paper are in the back. Those are also complimentary, so please take that.
I'm happy to sign if you promise to read it.
Yeah. And Andy will sign if you promise to read it. Please join me in thanking Andy Posner and David Burton for joining us. Thank you all for being here today.